Dr. Cheryl Kirk-Duggan, thank you so much for joining me today on the Vanderbloemen Leadership Podcast. You're actually a part of our series that we're doing in February called the History and Evolution of the Black Church. And I am so happy to have you on. I know that you are a professor of religion at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. But can you just tell our listening audience a little bit about you and what you do for Shaw University, which is a historically Black college and university?
Yes, thank you, Sister Chantel, for having me on. I am thrilled and happy to be here. I am Professor of Religion and Director of Women's Studies at Shaw University in the Divinity School. Shaw was founded in 1865 when Dr. Martin and his beloved wife, Sarah Baker Leonard Tupper, came to the South to help people who were new to freedom to get an education. In fact, it was started more or less like a theological school, and at one time had a medical school and a law school until about 1918 when it closed, of course, for financial resources. Shaw is the oldest historically Black college and university in the South, and many of the other schools, including North Carolina A&T, which is one of the largest HBCUs, came from people who went to Shaw. Also, people
Mm-hmm.
like Ella Baker and SNCC and many of the luminaries that we'll be talking about today either attended school at Shaw, worked at Shaw, or visited the campus.
How wonderful. What a rich history. And you have the opportunity to not only be a part of it, but to impact the next generations that are coming through that university. That's so wonderful. So you and I today, we're going to talk a little bit about um, during this series, we are talking about like the Jim Crow era to um, the civil rights kind of right leading up into Dr. King's civil rights movement. So before we really dive deep, could you give us a little understanding, some context about what is the Jim Crow era? We hear this word often, and maybe some people don't quite understand what that really is. What was going on also in our nation during that time?
Thank you. That is a great question. And you're right. And with attorney Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, that came out a few years ago that deals with mass incarceration, all of a sudden that language became back parlance into the vocabulary. To understand Jim Crow, I need to back up a little bit because many people aren't aware of the fact that in the year 98, Tacitus, a philosopher, wrote a book called Germania. And in that book, he espoused Anglo-Saxon superiority. And people can read more about that in the book by the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who's Dean of the Episcopal School at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Her book, Stand Your Ground, which she wrote Black Bodies and the Justice of God, which she wrote in response to the murder of Trayvon Martin. So she
Okay.
tells about Tacitus. So just think about it, 60 years after the time Jesus did ministry, was crucified and resurrected, Tacitus coins this ideology of Anglo-Saxon superiority. It morphs its way through the late Greco-Roman era, through the time of the Victorian era, and it comes to the United States with the Pilgrims and the Puritans.
Mm-hmm.
They take that sense of white then superiority and marry it to two other concepts. One was manifest destiny, which says God has called us to this work. We are the new Israel, we are the new Jerusalem, therefore we are to come to this place which becomes the United States. We can conquer the land, clear anybody off of it so they could justify the murder and then later putting on plantations, because that's what a reservation is of all of our Native American brothers and sisters. In fact, even putting things like smallpox and blankets give to them to kill them, that those that they did not kill with guns and those that they did not then put on reservations, including at that time, many of the children were taken from their parents and put in missionary schools.
Mm-hmm.
So the larger reality of Christianity as it has been lived and practiced in the United States, we have a lot to atone for because it really does not parallel the religion of Jesus. So that's the background. So they took manifest destiny plus white supremacy and merged it with American exceptionalism. In other words, we're the best, we're the brightest. So those three then set the tone for where we are today and we get to Jim Crow. So after the Civil War, and President Abraham Lincoln, which was fought not to free those who were enslaved, but to keep the Union together. In the release of those who were enslaved, because that's the language they rather than saying slavery, because slavery implies that people had a chance to choose that. So in biblical terms, people can say, I will be your slave to work off a debt. Those who were stolen or kidnapped from Africa or sold into enslavement by other folks who are in Africa did not choose this. They made it through the Middle Passage. They get to this country, and so when you get to after the Emancipation Proclamation, then you have the 13th Amendment being ratified, which says enslavement should not happen, except for that little funny little clause in there, which people can be made slaves in terms of if they've done something wrong. And so I also commend to your listeners the movie 13 by Ava DuVernay, which further explores that. After the ratification, we had Reconstruction, which at that time the Republicans were on the side of justice. People were supposed to get their 40 acres and a mule. People were made free, but what happened was the troops were taken out of the South. There are, in many instances, were more Black people than white people. So there's this element of fear. And imagery is very important. You also have D.W. Griffith doing his movie at that time, and I'm blanking on the name right now, but the imagery of the movie, Birth of a Nation. The imagery of that movie, two things stick out to me on that. One is that they depict Black legislators as buffoons, as idiots, as people jumping on down tables with comedic actions, which was far from the truth. But this is what hit the movie houses, one of the first movies in the United States. That scene, as well as a white woman jumping off a mountain because she so-called fears being raped by a Black man. So this is the imagery that's put forward, which instills fear, which negates any of the beauty of Blackness, negates the intellectual prowess and capacities of the Black legislatures that we had. And also it continues to stereotype, and even to this day, where Black men are often stereotyped as hypersexualized studs, as thieves, as criminals, and Black women are often stereotyped either as a mammy, asexual, or as a Jezebel, a harlot and a whore, or as a sapphire, one who's always cutting Black men down, or as a welfare queen, one who's out to have babies to just get money. All of these are myths, but they have been broadly broadcast. And so we have to help people think about, what are you seeing? Who's selling it to you, and for what purpose? All to discount Black people, their intelligence, their gifts, their graces. So after you have the 13th Amendment, there's a lot of fear. Well, what are these Black people going to do now that they can vote? Because during enslavement, it was illegal for Black people to vote, to read, to write, or to get married. Thus, when emancipation does happen, but you have people who are newly freed but no place to go and no skills and no money, many people ended up back doing sharecropping, and they had to get their supplies from the company store, as it were. Therefore, it's a different type of enslavement. At the same time this has happened, you have Jim Crow developing in terms of Black codes, which were strict codes, both local codes and state law, that orchestrated when and where Black people could vote, when and where they could work, and how much they could be paid. Most often they were paid little to no compensation. There was voter suppression put in place. You had those persons who'd been Confederate soldiers. Many times they became judges and police. So the next thing you have happening is labor camps and convict leasing. So having inmates to do labor is not something new. And today they're no longer only doing license plates. Some of those computer components that we have in our smart devices are being made in jails, especially now that we have privatized prisons. And with the privatized prisons, you no longer have some of the checks and balances. They're not trying to rehabilitate. They want people to stay in, because the more warm bodies they have in cots, the more money that they're making. Back in 1865, you also have the birth of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan in Pulaski, Tennessee. there. So you have white supremacy growing. You have and also you have the red shirts that happened a little bit later in the 1800s, 1890s in North Carolina. Those red shirts that we saw at the Capitol insurrection, January 6th of 2021, was some of the same people that did insurrections in places like Wilmington, North Carolina, where there were many Black businesses thriving. People were murdered, or their properties and lands were stolen. They were run out of town. The same thing happened in Florida. The same thing happened in Oklahoma, what they called Black Wall Street. That happened in the 1920s. Meanwhile, while all these bad things were happening, you also had some good things happening, like Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who raised funds and started the Palmer Institute as a place of education for children in North Carolina. You had Isaiah Montgomery, who thought, he like Marcus Garvey, who thought, I don't know if this integration experiment is going to work, therefore we need separate. So Isaiah Montgomery founded the town of Mount Bound, Mississippi, which still exists today, and it's about 100% Black. So you had those instances, and there's also Grambling, Louisiana was predominantly Black town, Louisiana, and I'm blanking on the town in Florida that also had a similar experience. In the 1920s, with all of these insurrections, all of these lynchings, you also had people like Ida Wells Barnett, who was a person who lived in Memphis. One day she was removed from a train that she paid passage to ride. And so she got very active and had a newspaper and was advocating against lynching. Things got so bad that they burned her business. So she left and went to the North. And I'll mention some other names as well. The NAACP noticed that at the end of World War I, lynchings increased. You have Black soldiers coming back, both in World War I and World War II, fought for their country, and especially in World War II in Paris. I got a chance to do the Black Paris tour. Soldiers really helped. Paris and France would not be the same without the Black soldiers that came over to help liberate that area. But when these Black soldiers came back, how dare they wear uniforms? Many of them were lynched because they said, no, you aren't a person. And some of it goes back to that 3/5 compromise, when, for the purpose of census, that's why you always have to follow the Benjamins. Enslavement was started because of money. They needed cheap labor, or no-cost labor. If you go throughout history, every time there's an influx of attack on Black and brown bodies, there's always a financial element. And it's a sad state of affairs for us that US capitalism is tied into greed. With the 1920s came the Great Migration. So you had a lot of people leaving the South, especially with Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North and South Carolinas, Florida, headed. Many went to Chicago, and you can track it with the music and the blues and follow the Mississippi River. Many also relocated to New York. In fact, during my New York years, like the late 70s, early 80s, I was at a church, the William Institutional See-Me Church, where I was the organist and directed 2 choirs up in Harlem, and they had a Carolina club. And I'm going, I've been Methodist all my life. I've never heard of a Carolina club. I said, what's a Carolina club? There were so many people who had migrated from North and South Carolina who attended that church that they had a Carolina club. So with the migration, you also had the Great Depression, and because of the Depression, when resources get smaller, people get nervous and have a need to control. So there was more, again, suppression of Black people. You had the more segregation. So the laws were put in place that there was separate toilet facilities, separate fountains. Black people could not use any public facilities. You could have the money, you could still not go into a Hilton or a Marriott. If you went to a professional football or basketball or baseball game, there was a Black section. Movie theaters, there was a Black section. At this time, you also had, in many Black communities that were thriving, you would have Black businesses where Black people could attend. So I grew up, my primary care doctor was his office was across the street from our house. It was Black. My dentist, I walked 2 blocks down the other direction. We had Black barbers, Black beauticians, Black cleaners, dry cleaners, mortuaries, pretty much everything we needed to have, because I did grow up in the segregated South. We had it. We went to church with our teachers.
Yeah.
And because of redlining, it didn't matter how much money you made. There were certain areas you were not allowed to live in. In
Mhm.
fact, I was on sabbatical in Austin, Texas. I learned in the 1920s there were Black people lived all over Austin, but the city of Austin had this decree that if you were Black, you had to live in East Austin. If you lived other places, they would cut off your utilities. So even if you kept the house there, you wouldn't be able to get utilities, nor would your children be able to go to school. And you
Mhm.
could track it, because I wondered when I did my master's of music at the University of Texas at Austin, where are the Black people? And then I noticed literally I-35
Mhm.
split the town in half. Now, once the University of Texas started morphing across I-35 over to the east side, gentrification and major manufacturers like Dell and Google and others, people who relocated from Silicon Valley to push those out in San Francisco, those in San Francisco pushed them out into Oakland. Those lived in Oakland, they got pushed out. And so many of them have come to Texas, places like North Carolina, and gentrification is horrible. I was just in Austin, like I said, I left in 2020. There were places I couldn't even recognize. It's like, what
Mhm.
street am I on? And
Mhm.
many of the Black churches that had been in East Austin have now pushed out much further because their people are living much further. So I know of people who are making six figures, Black folk, white folk as well. They cannot build in Austin. They have
Mhm.
to go 2, 3, 4 towns over if they're going to build housing because it's gotten so expensive. Many people from coming from California, they sold their houses for high six figures. They can come in, and many what they've done, they bought housing, say 120, 250,000, and they will tear that down or remodel. It's now valued at 650,000. So
Correct.
Black people that live in that area now cannot afford the property taxes. And so that's
Mhm.
been another major issue. The other things that happened in 1948, the military was integrated. 1954, you had Brown v. Board of Education. That was a Supreme Court case which said separate is not equal. 64, you had the Civil Rights Act ending segregation, or at least on the books.
Mhm.
1965, the Voters' Right Act, and 1968, the Fair Housing Act. The same time, many of our so-called Christians started all of these public Christian academies. And that was specifically designed so with the integration, so-called integration of schools, they didn't want those Black boys sitting next to those white girls and those white boys sitting next to those Black girls. So they created all these private academies. That
Mhm.
and No Child Left Behind, which is required teachers to teach to the test, along with closing a lot of historic Black high schools, alternative trade schools, have decimated our educational system. And
Mhm.
the other thing I want to say that happened in the 1950s, after Dwight Eisenhower had been a general in World War II and was driving on the Autobahn, which is that their major superhighway. I had a chance to ride on it. I was doing some backup singing. We did 30 concerts in 6 weeks. So I was on the Autobahn a lot. There's no speed limit. So I'm going,
Correct.
I don't know if I like this not having a speed limit. But Eisenhower saw that in the late 40s and 50s and said we need to bring that to the United States. And we did need better transportation. But did all of the highways, whether it's 85, 95, those going north south, and those going east west, 10, 20, 40, 80, almost in every instance, they went through Black communities.
Mhm.
Many instances usurping thriving business, and people didn't have a choice because the government was able to get the property by eminent domain. The
Mhm.
problem is once that happened, many of those communities never came back together again.
You're absolutely correct that people of color, females, were not included in the minds of those who crafted that document. But I do think that that's how big our God is, that the language was so broad that today we have the opportunity to grab hold of what was written then to not include us, but truly it does because we are all mankind, as the document says. Very good, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So will you talk a little bit about, because you have given us a lot of meat to chew on and some great resources to look up and partake of. will you now wrap that in Christianity? How has Christianity been used from Jim Crow to Dr. King's day, moving into that civil rights? How has Christianity been used to sort of control or keep enslaved Black people? And with that came the emergence of the Black church into the civil rights movement. How did those two marry?
Thank you. Great question. As I said, Tacitus coined white supremacy. So that came with the Pilgrims, and the Pilgrims and Puritans came with their understanding of Christian commitment to take the land, to make this the new Israel. And so it's even interesting that you have like the Salem witch trial, which was a farce. It was just some girls being hysterical. And what happens, there's only two energies in the universe, love and fear. And when people get trapped up in fear, they move to control, even if there's no basis in it. So people were lynched, were hung, known as witches. People use the Bible to support enslavement. In fact, when I was doing my dissertation several years ago, when I was looking at the redacted African-American theodicy and the redacted African-American spirituals of the 1960s civil rights movement, which I'll unpack. Theodicy is a doctrine that basically said there's a good God, bad things happen. Why does that happen? So philosophers and theologians have written tons and tons of ink about that. So I wanted to look at how do you deal with justice? How do we deal with God, with enslavement, and specifically looking at this music. So over my head, I hear music in the air becomes over my head, I hear freedom in the air. There must be a God somewhere. There were also popular music that they then took and changed the words. So the song that the great civil rights activist Harry Belafonte had popularized, the Banana Boat song, Day-O, Day-O, daylight coming, I want to go home, becomes freedom, freedom, freedom coming, I want to go home. So those, and then there was some music like by folks like Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan was in the quartet of freedom singers, and they wrote specific songs, because there's one song goes that my dog a love of your dog and your dog a love of my dog. Why can't we, like the dog, sit under the apple tree? And so what we have to do is people literally suspend logic many times when they deal with their faith. Unfortunately, no place does the Bible, either the Hebrew scriptures or New Testament, say that slavery is wrong. In the Hebrew Bible, it says, it talks about the year of Jubilee. So if I've put myself in slavery to pay off a debt, then when the year of Jubilee comes, I should be released after I've lived off my debt. In the New Testament, in Philemon, Paul says, treat your slave, and the term for slave and servant is the same term, doulos. It's translated either servant or slave, like a brother. But we don't want to be treated like some people treat their brothers. Never says that slavery is wrong. So people, and then there's a text where it says, servants or slaves, be obedient to your masters. So people use that text. In fact, Howard Thurman's, the great theologian and mystic, who was basically a pastor and a mentor to many of that 1960 civil rights era, his grandmother would say, you can read me anything in the Bible, but do not read me from Paul, because she knew that scripture had been used to support slavery. And it was after the, actually during the early mid 1700s, like as early as 1787, you have Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, who were Black ministers, part of the St. George's Church, who were told that you can no longer pray here, because in Methodism, altar prayer is one of the big important things that happens in worship. They said you can no longer pray here. They said, well, if we can no longer pray here, we can no longer stay here. So as early as 1790s, you have the beginnings of African Methodist Episcopal Church, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. The AME started in Philadelphia. The AME Zion started in New York. The SEME Church starts in, gets its founding dates December of 1870. But that started back in 1844 when the Bishop James O. Andrews had two slaves, male and female. He said he would let the male slave go, but would not let the female slave go. So at that time, those persons who were part of it was the Methodist Episcopal Church South, because most of the churches, I need to back up, had split over the slavery question. So you had churches in the North and the South. So Bishop Andrews was in Methodist Church South. So those that came out of that church became CME. It was Colored Methodist, 1870, and then in 1954 changed the name to Christian Methodist Episcopal. So the church has been on both sides of the question, because prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, many times slaves would worship with the congregation with white folk. Many times they'd be in the balcony or on a separate side. Sometimes, depending upon where you were located, a slave master might bring a preacher to come in and preach to the slaves. Sometimes the enslaved had their own worship activities. They call them in the hush harbors. So many times when they'd sing something like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, coming for to carry me home," they weren't singing about when they died. That might be the message that the Underground Railroad is coming, be ready. And so you have then, during the times of enslavement, during Reconstruction, Black churches starting to becoming independent from white churches. So the church at that moment became a place where people could advocate. And we have to be clear, not all churches were activists. We tend to romanticize Dr. King today. Number one, he was so young when he died, 39 years old. We still see him. If he was still alive today, he'd be in his late 80s, almost 90s. Many of the churches didn't want to have anything to do with King. King happened to be the new kid on the block when he got there in Montgomery, had not yet, say, owned a lot of property, hadn't a lot of made debt, hadn't met a lot of people. So a lot of the fellas said, well, King also, he happened to have the gifts and graces, very charismatic, very articulate. You be the spokesperson. In other words, you have a lot less to lose than we do. You're just getting here. And so then in 1954, you have, again, the Supreme Court decision. And in 1955, you also have the murder of Emmett Till. And so for our white sisters have to be very careful about how they understand who they are. Emmett had a lisp. He grew up in Chicago. He had a girlfriend who happened to be white. Came to Money, Mississippi to hang out in the summer, as a lot of people did. You go visit relatives in the summer. His cousins tried to tell him, be very careful. What we know is they were in the store. They went in for some cold drinks or sodas or something. It's not clear even to this day whether he whistled at the woman or spoke to her. But she lied, and before she died, she did tell the truth. But by this time, her husband and her brother were already dead. But she told them that basically Emmett had accosted her or made a pass at her. They came to Emmett's uncle's house, took him, brutalized him, beat him up, wired him to a part of an engine of a cotton gin, put him in the river. Mamie Till, his mother, said, I want the world to know what happened to my son. And so she required an open casket funeral. I'm amazed, number one, that they even allowed the body to be retrieved.
Yes, it's the truth.
And that she was able to get his body back to Chicago, and it made the news. It made Jet magazine, other magazines, and people were horrified. Could you do this? 14-year-old child.
Yeah.
And of course, so the churches had, some of the churches were in the foregrounds of activism, not all the churches, because a lot of them didn't like King. They were afraid. And so now we romanticize, now we do have a King's holiday, but that's why it's important to read the history. During the 60s, and I'm also amazed, when we back up, that the Montgomery bus boycott was successful. No one rode the bus for 360 plus days. Again, what we see is a lot of times laws cannot change people's hearts. Ethics do not change people's heart. Even the commandment that Jesus said in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, when one time a lawyer asked him, another time a rabbi asked him, one time the question is, what is the most important law? Another one, what is the greatest commandment? Another time, what must I do to be saved? Another time, what must I do to achieve eternal life? The answer is always the same, basically, love God, love your neighbor, love yourself with heart, mind, body, so with your whole self. If we could get people, if they throw away the rest of the Bible, and we could get people just to follow that, and by love, what do we mean? Appreciate people, show respect, do no harm. If we could get people to do that, I don't have to like you. I don't have to like McHenry, but I'm not going to do anything to demonize her. I'm not going to steal from you. I'm not going to lie on you. I will be gracious to you, and we can agree to disagree without being disagreeable. We can revolutionize life. But again, love and fear. And because, for example, during the Obama years, people thought, a lot of white people thought that, especially poor white people, oh, the black people got all the edge, now they got everything. We didn't get everything.
So when you think about that time frame of the civil rights movement, there was a lot of violence going on. There was violence against the Black church, violence against young children, as you mentioned in Till. There were lynchings and beatings that were taking place, lots of it under the auspice of Christianity. So, can you talk a little bit about like, what's the church? What was the church's identity at that time? The Black church. What was sort of you talked about where everyone wasn't necessarily a part of the civil rights movement when it came to the Black church, but what was the church's identity? Where was its purpose rooted in? And talk a little bit. You've touched on it some, but talk a little bit about the differences between the church in the South and the church in the North. I come from the family that migrated from Louisiana, right? Both sides of my family, and ended up in the Midwest outside of Chicago. My grandparents on my mother's side, they were probably one of the first few Black families that lived in that community. So um, there was definitely this migration that was happening, but there was an identity that was tied to the difference between the South and the difference between the North, even as it related to our churches. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure, but first I have to ask you, what part of Louisiana were your folks from?
Yes. So my mother's side of the family is from a small town called Colfax, or if you say it proper, Colfax, and which is about 20 miles outside of Alexandria. Then my dad's
Mhm.
side of the family is from a really small town right outside Monroe, Louisiana.
See, I've got there are Kirks and Kirkpatricks all up in there. So if we got to talking offline at some point, I may know some of your folks.
Okay.
Because my dad, he did cement finishing, and as a part of the CCC, he was a spiritual leader. I'm doing some research on his life of some
Mm-hmm.
9,000 young men.
Wow, how
Many
awesome.
of them, this was the first time they were going to actually be able to get a job and have money to send back. And many of them got education through this process. And in fact, Dad was with a group of men that helped to remodel the church that I grew up in, Reeves Temple, CME Church in Lake Charles over on Winterhalter Street. Mother grew up in Lake Charles, which is Calcasieu Parish. So I'm sure we've got some other connections.
Mm-hmm.
What's very interesting, the church again was founded to help people who had many of them formerly enslaved to have a chance to worship as full citizens.
Mm-hmm.
Whether, no matter what type of work people did during the week, a lot in the South, a lot of Black women cleaned houses, they did domestic work. The movie The Help shows a lot of that story. Some Black folks had their own businesses in the Black community. The church was a place where they could be called Mr. Brown and Miss Brown. The
Mm-hmm.
church where they were somebody, where they could hold offices, where they could pool their resources. Excuse me. In many instances, before there were public schools, churches had elementary and junior high schools. That's where children got to learn how to read and write. When many people moved north, churches were doing some of the same thing. The difference between the North and the South in large is that folks did not like Black people in the South, but individuals could be part of white families. In fact, a lot of families, white families, if they didn't have anything else, they had a maid.
Mm-hmm.
And many a white child was raised by that Black maid. In fact, I have a friend who once was working in an office in Austin, Texas, and when she hired the woman who was white, she said that woman was raised mostly by a Black woman because of how the person comported themselves. In the North, Black people were generally accepted, but not necessarily liked individuals. So there was racism in both areas. It's just a matter of how it presented itself. So, for example, when many people leave the South, they're taking the blues with them, and the late Dr. Jim Cone wrote the book, The Spirituals and the Blues. Well, Thomas Dorsey played honky tonk throughout the week, and on Sunday played in church and later ministered. So what we get gospel music is a combination of hymns and blue notes. Most churches have gospel choirs. Now we have, many churches have, even pre-COVID, they'll have electric guitar, they'll have somebody on drums, an electronic keyboard that can transpose for them. They may have a Hammond B3 organ, maybe have a saxophone. People didn't want gospel music. Dance in church, I don't think so. So for a lot of our folks who are under the age of 40, they don't know there was a time you did not have drums in church. You might have had a pipe organ and the grand piano on upright. It was only, we talking 70s, let's see, you get some of the gospels, early gospels, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, when James Hawkins and the Hawkins Singers, Walter Hawkins, when Oh Happy Day became popularized, then people started having gospel music was more okay to have in the church. And then you start to get a few combos and drums. Liturgical dance, we're talking the 90s before you get in liturgical dance. And now we have liturgical dance and mime. All of that was more recent. And some churches would have hissy fits. Folks broke from churches because of that. So churches, some, depending upon the denomination and the traditions, some were more active with social ministries and social justice. Some weren't. Again, in the 20s, especially in the North, you had what was called institutional churches. Institutional churches were those that were intent on making sure if people needed education, then they had reading and writing classes taught at church. If they needed to sew, to get a trade, sewing classes. Some of the churches had nursing classes. And also the churches partnered like with institutions like the YMCA. So in Harlem, some people would go learn how to be an LPN through the YMCA, and other churches like Abyssinia Church and Williams Institutional Church. These churches ministered to the whole community. When AIDS pandemic broke out, one of the doctors in the church came to Dr. Smith and said, I am tired of people saying that they died of cancer and we're not having a way to treat people. So then Allen Temple's church, they were one of the first churches to have a credit union. Then they formed the, I think it's called Allen Temple Arms. They built housing so AIDS patients could have a place to stay. So the church throughout has had an opportunity to do those kinds of social justice ministry. More recently, you had the Black Pact coming through with persons like Reverend Mike McBride, who came through and had buses and advocating for justice and advocating work with persons like Honorable Stacey Abrams and now Senator Warnock and pastors like Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III. And if people have not seen Otis's Dream, it's available on YouTube. It shows when, let's see, there's this younger son, Otis Moss III. Otis Moss Jr. was his dad. Then the first Otis Moss, he wanted to go and vote. He got his voter's registration card and he got dressed up, walked to go and vote. They said, oh no, you can't vote here. Oh, oh yeah, we see this piece of paper. Oh, you at the wrong polling place. Go so-and-so place. So he walked there. oh, we're sorry, you got to go so and so. By the time he got to the place where they allegedly said he could vote, they close the door and say you're too late. So I really commend people to watch. It's a beautifully done documentary to get a sense of what it was like when people couldn't vote. So the church, when it has chosen to do so, has done a phenomenal job even today at helping people organizing. There were actually, for the 2020 election, many clergy came from all over the country to places like even Georgia to stand at the polls and to pray that justice, as Amos 5:24 says, would roll down like a mighty river. So the church has been active. Some churches not so much. So it depends upon the geographical location, the church's polity, how much they were into social justice, and the local congregation and what they did, because churches have been burned, crosses have been burned.
Yeah.
Because people advocated for justice. We're still not out of the woods because there's a lot of pain.
You know, how to bring that civil rights movement into today's vernacular, and how do we move the needle forward to help our people continue to grow and kind of take charge of their life, and the system that's out here to allow that to be torn down, that is against a population of people, gender, race, and it's just phenomenal. I got to tell you, you are a wealth of knowledge. You have shared so much with our listeners today. I really appreciate it. I would like, as we close out, if you know, let's say, because you've given us so many resources, and hopefully we'll be able to pull those and kind of put them into some type of document people could access. But if you could leave our audience with, let's say, one piece of document, article, book, or documentary that you would charge them to watch as it relates to helping understand the Black church and the Black community as we move forward with this reconciliation, what would that be?
That is a hard one because several books come to mind, but one, I would say the book by Resmaa, Resmaa, Menakem, Menakem, My Grandmother's Hands. He's a practicing psychologist in Minnesota, and he talks about the Black body, the white body, and the police body. And I think if people tapped into that, that would help them understand what it is that they're seeing, why Black bodies are traumatized, why people believe that, a lot of white people believe that a Black body is impervious to pain. Then Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas's book, Stand Your Ground, it gives a history about white supremacy and how a Trayvon Martin could die. There are just so many, I cannot think of just one book that I would suggest, but those two in terms of a larger picture. There's several books. I can give some authors' names by Dr. Willie Jennings has done a book, Dr. Raphael Warnock, Dr. Emily Towns, Kelly Brown Douglas, Cheryl Townsend Jokes If It Wasn't for the Women, talks about women. I'm gonna not name some people because I'm just not thinking about them now, but there are just so many. What I would invite them to do, Google Black Church and civil rights, and any of those books coming up. And oh, I have to give a shout out for my sister, Dr. French, Shanika Walker Barnes has done a book, two books that talks about Black women and their lives and trauma.